Kyle Mazer here for KMMphoto.com. We're going to do a little experiment today to teach you guys about exposure and how aperture, shutter speed, and ISO affect your exposure. So what we have here is we have a jar of light, even though it's red. This jar here is going to be our exposure bucket, and then this is going to help simulate our aperture. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to determine what a good exposure is. Now the light meter of your camera does a really good job of that. Okay, for us, for this demonstration, this line right here is going to be our exposure line. Okay, so we want to be able to fill up this bucket with light to get to our accurate exposure. This 100 here, I don't know if you can see it, is going to be our ISO. Okay, so if you're shooting at a low F number, like 3.5, 2.8, the hole that the light is allowed to go through is going to be very large. Okay, the bigger the light, the less time it's going to take to fill up our bucket. Just like with your camera, the more light comes into the camera, the faster your shutter speed can be. So in this case, we're going to be shooting wide open. So to fill our exposure, it doesn't take a long time. Now, if I were to put this back in, and I take my aperture, and I put my aperture on top, what's going to happen now is, because I have made that hole smaller, just like your aperture does, it's going to take longer for it to fill and get a proper exposure. So what this is doing is it's simulating how long your shutter would need to be open if you make your F number higher. So figure this is maybe F22 or F18. So as you can see, it's taking much longer to fill our exposure. I'm not going to sit here and let this fill all the way because it's just taking forever. So as I showed you before, your aperture also controls your depth of field. So let's say that you wanted to shoot a portrait. What you'd want is you'd want a large aperture. So you'd want a big hole. Okay, a big hole, we'd want a small F number. So if you had a 2.8 lens, you want to be shooting at f2.8. In that case, very quickly, your shutter speed can be fast. Now let's say you're in a situation where you're shooting maybe a landscape and you didn't have a tripod. Now in order to get that exposure where you want it to be, what you would need to do is you'd need to slow down your shutter speed. Because you're shooting a landscape, you want more things in focus. So you can close down your aperture or raise that F number. Now if you didn't have a tripod, your issue is going to be this: trying to handhold your camera long enough to get that exposure so it looks nice and sharp. So your option is to do this. You can raise your ISO. Okay? So what I did was I also made another mark down here at the bottom. This is going to simulate 800 ISO. So now I've taken my aperture, I've closed it up so less light is entering the camera. And now I'm going to take my shot, and you'll see that because my number here is much closer, our shutter speed doesn't have to be open quite as long. It's still taking forever, but it's much shorter than it would have been. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a demonstration and hopefully a better understanding of how your exposure and how aperture and ISO and your shutter speed affect your exposure. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. Kyle Mazer for KMMphoto.com. Thank you so much. See you later.